So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on this very chilly, load-shedding-ish afternoon. Our guest this afternoon is Dr. Melodie De Jager, and Melodie has done numerous talks for us. What is really important and where I have found Melodie's work very beneficial is helping patients to cope when they have a change in dominance. And it's really how to help them cope. Because often patients are told to just get on with their life. They still have one good eye. But as Melodie is going to explain now, that's not necessarily so. So Melodie, over to you, and we look forward to an interesting hour. Thank you so much. We will take questions at the end. Thank you, Melodie.
Thanks, Belinda. Thanks, Hazel. Thanks, Karen. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really wonderful, as always, to be with you. Let me just start sharing screen. There we go. So we're going to talk about the dominance factor and how it impacts on your patients. So the very first thing we need to say that dominance isn't in the general sense of the word that means overpowering. It's not like that at all. In this instance, when I talk about dominance, I'm referring to wherever there's two, the brain will always choose one. You see, the brain is a marvelous organ, but it's very economical in its use of energy. Well, I can also say it's lazy, but let's say it's economical in its use of energy. So if there's an easier route, it will always choose the easier route. Why? There's less resistance. And then if there's less resistance, it's so much easier to respond immediately. And that's what sometimes happens when there's a trauma, when there's a change in a person's life of whatever nature, whether there's an injury, whether there's trauma, whether it's a newborn baby, and the parents get news that's not that pleasant. What happens immediately is the brain goes in a form of shock. Well, that's not news. And normally a person may be very relaxed, very calm, very friendly, accommodating, easy to get along with, very nice and easy to connect with them. And then all of a sudden, when there's trauma, they move into the red. And the moment we're in the red, we're in that fight or flight mode. It's that ugly behavior of us humans that come to the fore that says something is not going so well. And the moment that happens, and it's unpleasant for the person, it's unpleasant for everybody else around them, all they really want is to understand and to be understood. So we're going to talk about dominance, and we're going to talk about your client. We're going to marry these two during the course of this afternoon. And I found this to be such an incredibly beautiful drawing of a little person. And if you look at that drawing, you actually see so much. And let's only speak about the eyes this afternoon, not about any of the other senses or limbs that one can lose and the impact it has on a person. If you just look at those eyes, and you can see there's something different. And if you look at the mouth, that shock. And if you look at those hands, if it was possible, I'm sure we would have seen that every hair on that person's body was standing on end, because the moment there's loss, there's trauma, we need to adapt. And we tell people, all you need to do, as Belinda just said in the intro, is all you need to do is be grateful for what you've got and then learn to adapt. And it's not without empathy. But that's pretty much the message. You need to learn to adapt. But how do you do that? Well, because I come from a teaching background, I know that the ability to adapt, your ability to learn, means the ability to adapt. But before you can adapt, before you can learn, we need to break it down, because how do you adapt? What are the steps in adapting? What are the steps in learning? And if you look at the human being from a neuroscience perspective, and in my language, neuroscience perspective means the role of the physical body in the learning process. We immediately have to look at the senses, the brain and the muscle, because that's how That's how information flows through the brain. That's how information flows through the entire person. And that's how we make sense of our world. So the senses, you see, let me start somewhere else. The brain is in the ultimate isolation chamber. So it sits up here in its very thick skull. It's well protected, but it's also incredibly isolated. So it needs input and it needs output because it can't act on its own. It can't perceive on its own. It needs input from the senses that will then send the information to the brain and the brain to the muscles, because without muscles, there's no way that one can impact or behave in any way. Daniel Volpert, a neuroscientist, says this most amazing thing. He says, we have a brain for one reason only, and that is not to think. He says, you can think all you want. You're not going to change the world or impact on the world. So as a therapist, as a caregiver, as a partner, it's very difficult to support somebody else unless there's output. So behavior is an output. And if you see this kind of behavior, and not all people, some people experience trauma in a very quiet, very withdrawn way. Some people do it pretty loudly and pretty obviously. You see, the thing is, we need to look at those 3 steps: the senses, the brain, and the muscles, to understand what needs to happen in the brain and body before a person can adapt. So the moment we look at the senses, there are many senses. And generally, I use the 5 sense model, which is the sense of touch, the sense of smell, the sense of taste, the sense of hearing, and the sense of sight. It's not the only senses. There's proprioception in the vestibular system over here as well. So there are many senses. But the senses of hearing and sight are paired. Everything else, the sense of touch, the sense of movement and balance, the sense of smell, and the sense of taste, there's one skin, there's one vestibular system, there's one nose, there's one mouth, but there are 2 ears and there are 2 eyes. And as we said, we're going to look at dominance. So for the purpose of this afternoon's conversation, we're going to focus on the last 2 senses, or the last, which are both paired senses. And those are the ears and the eyes in that sequence. Okay, so we first unpack a model, and we first build the model. Then we unpack that model and we see how does that impact and show us what a client is experiencing, to give us a glimpse of their world. You see, what we so battle to do sometimes is to transition from our map of the world to somebody else's. But the moment you understand which senses they prefer to use, and in that sensory system, which one of the 2, because where there are 2, the brain tends to prefer to choose one specific one. Why? Because it's economical in its use, and the more it uses the same body part, the more myelinated the pathway becomes, and the easier it becomes to use that pathway. There's less resistance, and it becomes default behavior. So we want to unearth a client's default behavior. We need to understand that before we can really reach them. For me, one of the most important things in the world is to be able to connect. Because if I can't connect, how can you learn from somebody? How can you appreciate somebody? How can you guide somebody if you're a therapist or a person in a support function or in a medical profession? So every person has sensory input, and that comes in through the eyes and the ears, all the other senses as well. But predominantly, if you want to adapt, we use the 2 paired senses because they speak to the thinking part of the brain, so the left and the right side of the brain. And that's why they're colored. We use 2 different colors. So the left side of the brain, which just for fun purposes, we color code in blue. So the left brain is blue, and we color code the right brain in red, and it obviously controls the opposite side of the body. Now, What I'm saying now is not anatomically 100% correct. It's physiologically not 100% correct, but it's a model. And it's a very handy model that I've probably used now for close to 20 years. And I am yet to meet a person that didn't in the end say, but how did you know? And then I feel very good about their comment because it means I got them. I got them. And it's not that I got them, it's not an ego thing. It's that the instrument actually works pretty well and unearthing unconscious patterns that lead to behavior and that helps us to understand why people behave the way they do or respond the way they do, especially when they experience trauma or difficulty, stress as well. So if we look at the ears at the top, so the red ear, and my body, this is left, talks to the right side of the brain, and that means the right side of the brain, remember it's a model, the right side of the brain is the non-verbal side of the brain. Yes, there's language on the right side of the brain. Of course there is. We cannot isolate and say language on the left. Some people say very little else on the right. It's not completely true. But for this afternoon, let's just agree that the left side of the brain is the verbal side of the brain, and verbal comprehension occurs on the right. Okay, so understanding, comprehension sits on the right. It also means that the right side of the brain is not emotional. The limbic system, or the emotional part of the brain, is emotional. The right side of the brain is sensitive. Now, is there a difference between sensitivity and emotions? Yes, there are. The right brain is sensitive to nonverbal information. Now, if you transfer that to the red ear, it means the red ear listens to tonality. The red ear listens to how you say things, not necessarily what. And as we said, every client has a dominant ear, either left or right. And if you just ask a client to pick up a phone and watch towards which ear do they move that phone, and you ask them to do the same thing a little bit later, you may see the exact same repetitive behavior. They tend to favor one ear. What about the other one? Is it not working? Yes, it's working, but the brain has chosen, and it has chosen the left or the right ear. So the left ear is marvelous at listening to non-verbal information. So, sometimes when you have a conversation with the person and you ask them, how are they? And they say, fine. The blue ear that feeds verbal information to the verbal blue side of the brain hears fine. Tick, they're fine. The red ear hears that tonality is belying the words. So I don't think you are that fine, are you? So what is really going on? And it's only when we ourselves pick up on the non-verbal information that you sometimes realize the non-verbal information is more honest than the verbal information. So the red ear tends to listen to tone, while the blue ear listens to the what are you saying, the words specifically. Okay, I'm first going to explain the model and then we'll apply it to client. Okay, in terms of the eyes, you know that there is no such thing. That the left eye is controlled by the right brain and the right eye is controlled by the left brain. The visual system is a very complex system. So let me rather explain it like this. Let's rather say the red eye represents the right visual field and the blue eye represents the left visual field. So how can we do this? Well, it's very simple. If you create a little hole between your thumbs and the palms of your hands, and you straighten your arms and you look through that hole, but it must be a small hole with both your eyes simultaneously, and you focus on something specific. If you want to do it with me, it's much easier, much nicer to experience and to be told. So if you stretch your arms out, focus on something with both eyes open, and then you close the one eye without moving your arms or your head, and can you still see it? And if you can still see it, just notice which eye is open, and then close the eye that's open and open the other one if you can, and you will most probably see that the object has moved. So the eye that maintained the object that you focused on initially may be the dominant eye. Okay, and that means, and if you look carefully after this presentation and you do that a couple of times, you'll see the eyes jump in a very specific direction. So the left eye has a natural tendency, the red eye has a natural tendency to focus towards the right, while the right eye has a natural tendency to focus towards the left. And just because this is a functional model, we therefore say that the red eye works more in terms of the non-verbal information. Okay, it's more focused on shape, on color. Let's make it very simple and say the red eye works with the red brain. So it's the more creative eye, it's the more artistic eye even for some people, where the blue eye is the more critical and analytical eye. It's the eye that easily sees when there's a mistake. They don't have to look. People with a blue eye dominance don't have to look for a mistake. They see it easily. If there's a document, they don't have to read the document, apparently. The words just jumped, all the spelling mistakes or all the alignment mistakes, it just jumps out at them. So the blue eye is more logical, it's more critical, it's more analytical. The blue ear is more logical, it's more critical, it's more analytical. The red ear and the red eye are more forgiving. It's easier for a person with a red ear dominance and a red eye dominance to change. Why? Because they don't have facts on you see, that red eye and the red ear looks at the world as though it's something full of potential. It's possibility, where blue tends to favor facts and wants stuff in information in very neat boxes. It needs to be labeled and it needs to be in a box, because the moment it's like that, they feel more confident. So information, predictability, sameness soothes the blue part of the brain and the blue ear and the blue eye, while the red eye and ear and brain doesn't necessarily work like that. They work more vaguely. If you want to, you can say everything that's blue is more black and white, and everything that's red is more like a rainbow, if that makes any sense to you. There's more, the red side is more forgiving, it's more accommodating, okay? But it's more sensitive. And we'll get back to that a little bit later. So now information comes through a person's dominant eye and its dominant ear. We've determined which eye is dominant by looking through the hole. We've determined which ear is dominant. And it's not 100% accurate, but it's a functional model. It gives us a clue to the way a person's wiring has developed in a very specific pattern. So when we get that information, then flows to the brain, and it always flows to the bottom part of the brain first. If you look at that image at the bottom, you'll see that orange arrow. It shows you that information gets in through the bottom part of the brain. It's the survival part of the brain. That's the sensory motor part of the brain. And then it goes through the middle part of the brain. So we say one mind, but three brains. One mind, but three brains. A survival brain, an emotional brain or a limbic system, and then the cortex or the thinking part of the brain. So information always comes in through the survival part of the brain, and then it has to go through the emotional part of the brain. This is very important. So information from the senses go through the survival part of the brain, through the emotional part of the brain, before you can start thinking about things. Perception happens in the thinking part of the brain. Thinking about things happens in the thinking part of the brain, obviously. So information comes in and it hits that emotional part of the brain. And all of a sudden, the information that reaches the emotional part of the brain doesn't work the way it used to before the trauma, before the accident. A person immediately feels uncomfortable. because they're not receiving information through the myelinated pathways. They're not receiving information through those pathways and those sensory organs, the left or the right eye, the left or the right ear, that they are used to. So the kind of information that now flows to the emotional part of the brain is different. And you must remember sameness soothes. So what the brain is used to is always soothing. That's why you can relax when things are predictable around you. And that's why times that we are living in at the moment is so challenging, because it's very difficult to predict what comes next. Moment information, it's that emotional part of the brain. It determines whether information will go up to the thinking part of the brain, so a person can think about it, stop the behavior, think about it, and choose a response. Because if information doesn't get to the thinking part of the brain, you can't change your response. It's automatic, it's too fast. Everything below the thinking part of the brain, so that is the survival brain and the limbic system, the information runs through it so very quickly. You're not consciously aware of what is happening. And once you've responded, well, you realize I've just responded without choosing my behavior. So the emotional impact of a change in dominance is phenomenal. Let me just finish the whole model, and then we'll come back to how does it really affect your clients. So once information has traveled through the emotional part of the brain, and it goes up to the thinking part of the brain, okay? It goes either to the back or the front part of the brain first. Remember, we've got a whole brain. Remember, we've got two eyes. Remember, we do have two ears, but we prefer to use one specific eye or ear. We do have a bottom and a top part of the brain, all of us, but information tends to pause either at the bottom or the top a fractionally longer, and it influences the way we think and respond to information. So when information flows to the top part of the brain and it goes to the back part of the brain, if a person is experiencing trauma, they immediately become quiet and withdrawn. Why? Because that's what the back part of the brain does. The back part of the brain doesn't act. It's the sensory part of the brain is at the back. So it observes, it withdraws, it's very quiet because it's inputting information, or it's running dialogue, or it's running through scenarios, whatever the back part of the brain is doing, but the person is very, very quiet and withdrawn. You see, if we then ask the client questions and they don't respond and we think they're resistant, they're not necessarily resistant. They are just in the back of the cave. They're just in the back of the brain where they are processing. And in that moment, they literally cannot speak. And therefore, it's very difficult for them and actually creates a lot of tension when we constantly ask them to respond. To give you a very practical example, I recently saw somebody and their daughter was diagnosed with Stargardt's and everything, and she was a young little girl. And the impact on the family was phenomenal. And on this little girl, because she's bright as a button, what's happening is she's pretty aware of what is going on and how she's gradually losing her sight. And that awareness, because she was back brain dominant, pulled her into a very quiet space. Now, if a person goes quiet, it's very difficult for other people to know, are you good quiet or are you bad quiet? You understand what I mean by that? Are you quiet because you're well, or are you quiet because you are crying on the inside and you're not sharing with us, and then we can't reach you? It's the moment we understand that when a person goes to the back part of the brain, we need to give them time out. Because the moment we allow them time out, they can process, but we also have to come to some agreement that there's a time frame that one negotiates, that it's okay to withdraw. It's okay to go into your cave, but there comes a time when you need to move forward, because it's very, very difficult to know what is happening when a person withdraws like that. But no amount of prompting, no amount of questioning, asking, threatening, rewarding, and I'm specifically talking about children now, none of that works, because when they get stuck there, it's very difficult for them to come out. We'll talk what can you do about that a little bit later. So some children, some people, adults as well, when the information gets to the top part of the brain, the information chooses. It's dominant. The choice is either does it flow to the back part of the brain, sensory input and more reserved or introverted, or does it move to the front part of the brain? The action part of the brain is in the front, and the motor cortex is in the front. So, or does the information immediately go over to the front part of the brain, and the person is nearly hyperactive, maybe extremely talkative, but they find it very difficult to switch off. They find it very difficult to just stop, because the more they can tidy up, the more they can talk, the more they can be busy, the easier it is for them to process information. And you see, they don't necessarily want you to participate in a conversation. They actually talk to process. So it's important to know when the person that you live with or work with experience trauma, where do they go? First of all, in terms of the brain, do they stop on the emotions and they spend some time there and therefore are really, really experience things emotionally on a very intense level? Or, of course, they feel, but the information moves very quickly to the rational part of the brain, and it seems like they're not really touched by the circumstances because they're all very rational about stuff. Okay? When the information gets to the rational part of the brain, it's important to know, does the person favor the back part of the brain and therefore go quiet, or do they favor the front part of the brain and then they're not so quiet? They tend to move a lot. It's the motor, the movement part of the brain. But it's not that simple either, because there's a third dimension in the brain, and that's the left or right side. So one can go to the left back part of the brain, one can go to the right back part of the brain. And the way you would process in the two sides at the back won't be the same. You see, the left brain has this marvelous, or the blue brain has this marvelous ability to check information. I always think of the back left part of the brain as the researcher, gather information, factual information. And there's a way that things should be. And if it's not like that, they can do this analysis paralysis thing sometimes, okay? And especially if things aren't the way it should be, they can really spin on the same thought if they don't communicate and one can hear what's in their heart. What does the right back part of the brain do? It experiences things very intensely. So whatever happens, it always gets inflated a little bit. Okay, so the right side of the brain tends to color it in, becomes even worse than it is sometimes. So whatever happens in the back part of the brain, we do want people to move to the front, because otherwise we can't have a conversation. Otherwise, they won't let us into their world to enable us to guide them out of a tricky situation, especially if they're really battling to adapt. And what happens to the people where the information moves to the front part of the brain so very, very quickly? That means it's very difficult to reach them, because they don't give anybody a gap. They don't want to take information in. They're in control. They've got this. They're going to make things happen. And it's very, very difficult for them to just stop. Sometimes it's very difficult for them to stop and to grieve, because there's a grieving process. Whenever there's a huge change in one's life and it's irreversible, it's very difficult for them to stop. It's very difficult for them to listen. It's very difficult for them to input information, because why? The front part of the brain says output, 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 output. So as you can see, information flows. It flows from the dominant eye and ear, flows, it has to. There's no other way, through the survival part of the brain, through the emotional part of the brain, that either intensifies what a person is experiencing, or they experience that, but immediately it's not denial. The moment information flows to the thinking part of the brain, they're not denying the emotions. They actually don't spend enough time on them to recognize the emotions. Then the information always goes to the back part of the brain. For some people, the information pauses there. That's when they become withdrawal. And for some, it moves to the front very quickly. And the more doing people or the more talking people, the red brain tends to be more doing oriented. The blue part tends to be more talking oriented. And then we need to look at how would information ultimately flow out of the brain, because as I said, the brain is in the ultimate isolation chamber. So even though the front part of the brain is the movement part of the brain itself doesn't move. It uses muscles. Now, obviously, there are many muscles in the body. But in our model, we only look at the dominance of the hands and the dominance of the feet. So we've got 2 hands, 2 feet. And our model, we say the hands represent communication, because we write with our hands, we gesture with our hands. We say it represents communication, and whether it's in written form or verbal form. And the feet tell us how does a person go over into action in terms of the hands. If the blue brain is the verbal brain, the blue hand is the verbal hand. It's the talking hand. And what about the red hand? The red hand tends to gesture more. The red hand, a person with a red hand dominance would rather show you, demonstrate, than they would naturally want to tell. If I can give you a practical example of that, many years ago, I worked with my assistant, was busy with something. I had a client with me. It was a young child. And I went to her and I said to her, please, can you give me the little box with the colored sticks that you draw with? And she said to me, what do you want? And I said, the box with a colored stick that you draw with. And she said, Melodie, I have no clue what you want. And I thought, how many times must I tell you the box with the colored sticks that you draw with? And then it dawned on her and she said, crayons. And I said, but that's what I was saying. So you see, the red part of a profile tends to describe because it thinks and sees pictures, while the blue tends to label. It's much easier with a blue hand to communicate exactly. And then in terms of the feet, the red foot draws from the red side of the brain, which says, let's be creative and innovative in the way that we adapt to a situation. So in other words, a red foot makes it easier to adapt. Blue foot says there's a right way, and there's a way that things need to be. And if it's not like that, we have to get it that way, because there's an inclination to want to maintain the same, where the red part of the profile says, let's have some change. Let's have another way of doing something, just in a very simple, practical way. The blue foot would tend to like a certain sequence of events every morning. Get up, do this, do the following thing in a very specific sequence. And through that repetition, there's confidence, there's comfort, there's that sameness soothe principle, where the red foot says, nah, let's have a change. This is so boring. Let's just change sometimes for the sake of change. So the model is based on where there are two, one will always be chosen. And that's why I developed a program or a profiling instrument called the Mind Dynamics Profile, which is a neuroscience principle instrument that plots an individual's myelinated pathways that underpin default behavior. Okay, so myelinated pathways refer to which ear is dominant, which eye is dominant. Is the person bottom or top brain dominant? Is the person back or front brain dominant? Is the person left or right brain dominant? Is the person's left or right hand dominant? Is a person's left or right foot dominant? You see, when we talk about those different dominances and we create a specific profile. And that's the myelinated pathway. And as I said, myelinated pathway refers to the road of the least resistance. It's a little bit like the picture on the screen at the moment. Beautiful tall grass. And then there's a pathway that runs through that grass. Now, if a person has to choose, if they have to walk through this beautiful piece of nature, they would tend to walk on the pathway, wouldn't they? Yes, because there's more resistance in terms of the grass. The moment there's a person has a dominant eye, let's just focus on the eye for the moment, and say their dominant eye is the right eye, and say they use that right eye of theirs to proofread, or maybe they use their right eye for accounting, or maybe they use that right eye that's so incredibly good at spotting mistakes. Some people may hear that as a negative. It's not. The blue eyes of the world are responsible for maintaining standards. The blue eyes of the world are responsible for maintaining standards. Those are the people who easily see when something's supposed to be straight and it's not straight. They tend to want everything to line up. If there's books on a desk, they need to line up. So the moment a person with a blue eye dominance, remember, through repetitive use in the brain, there's a pathway like there is through this park. The moment they lose sight, or sight is diminishing in that blue eye, what happens? They need to create a new pathway. They need to walk through this beautiful garden. They're going to meet a lot of resistance. And all of a sudden, the qualities of their profile that gave them joy and that probably enabled them to do a specific job and excel in that. They can't do that anymore. If the blue eye was the dominant eye and there's an injury or trauma in that blue eye or with that blue eye, the impact on the person is enormous. Compare that to a person with a blue eye dominance, but there's an injury or trauma in the left eye. Okay, can they still maintain the pathway with a blue eye that's not affected? Can they still maintain their job? Can they still maintain the things and the actions and the behaviors that used to give them joy? Yes, they can. Of course, they're still impacted on, because the moment we lose any of our body parts, it has a huge impact on us on an emotional level, on many other levels as well, but first and foremost on an emotional level. Can you imagine if that person has a red eye dominance, for instance? Okay, so a person's red eye is dominant. That red eye enables them to imagine. It's the creative eye. It's the eyes that doesn't look at things as is. The left eye, I call the red eye, doesn't look at things the way they are. It looks at things and life and people, how it can be. So it automatically predisposes a person to be more creative, to be more artistic. It automatically opens up the possibilities for something like architecture or creative arts or interior design or graphic design, making pretty. You see, that red eye is not the words eye, it's the picture eye. The blue eye is the words eye. So if a person has a red eye and the red eye is particularly good at reading people and reading their behavior. Remember, it's nonverbal. Verbal is blue, nonverbal is red. So if a person has a red eye dominance, left eye dominance, and there's injury or trauma to that eye, Do you know how the entire world, it's like the blue eye person with the blue eye dominance that loses sight in the blue eye. Can you imagine what happens if a person is good at reading people, if a person is used to creating all kinds of visual images? Just remember something. They maintain their vision, but they don't necessarily maintain their sight. Difference between vision and sight. But can you imagine what an emotional impact it would have if a person can't read other people and other people's emotions? The presentation last week, the couple who did the presentation, I was so deeply touched by that presentation, and just that one comment, especially in terms of flirting and in a loving relationship, how it is impossible to pick up the nonverbal cues that's so part of the ability to connect with people. Can you imagine what it does to a person when they lose sight of that red eye, and the pathway through nature that they used to use, they can't use anymore? They now have to create a whole new pathway to the other eye that they still have, yes, but it takes time. And not only does it take time, and not only is there inherent resistance, not emotional resistance, not mental resistance, they have to create new pathways in the brain that become just as strong as the previous ones. So the brain will prefer the new pathways before it becomes a new skill, and we say the person has adapted. Life's not simple. And if a red eye is impacted on, it really changes a person's personality to a certain extent. The same with a blue eye. Because if they were critical and analytical, and all of a sudden they can't see to be critical and analytical, well, it depends on which side of the brain is dominant. But sometimes they become even more critical and analytical because they can't receive the information that they so desperately need to be able to feel confident and in control of the environment. So if a person has a red eye, left eye, and that eye is impacted on, they very often lose their passions. Lots of things that used to give them joy, but on an emotional level specifically, they lose that because they can't receive the information in the way that they used to. Yes, they can develop the blue eye, but the moment they develop the blue eye, it's not the eye that feeds information to the side of the brain that looks at potential. It's the eye that feeds information to the part of the brain that favors facts. Can you see that? All you need to do is adapt. Adapting on a neurophysiological level is not a simple thing. And not only do they need to adapt, let me just go back one step. Not only do people lose sight in one eye, they lose sight in both. You see, now they don't have the opportunity to develop the skills that the other eye can offer them. So what happens now? Now the brain says, well, it depends. You see, nature's amazing. It depends whether you were visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. You had a preference, because the brain doesn't only have a preference for a left or a right eye, a left or a right ear, a bottom or a top, a back or a front, a left or a right brain, a left or a right hand, a left or a right foot. The brain also has a preference for input from a specific sensory system. While the Penfield and later on Bandler and Grinder showed that the eye movements give us a bit of a glimpse on a person's sensory preference. Okay? So say a person loses sight in both eyes. Now we want to know, was vision the brain's preferred sensory modality? Because if it was, obviously, losing their sight would have a far greater impact than if vision wasn't their preferred sensory modality. I just want to reiterate what I said earlier on in terms of sensory development. The sense of touch, the sense of movement, the sense of smell, taste, hearing, and sight. It's the sequence in which the sensory systems unfold over time. What is amazing about the eyes, it's the last to develop. And I use my little finger to represent the eyes because the eyes, it's the most complex of all of our senses, and it relies heavily on the development of the other senses. Okay, so if we lose sight, we still have all the other senses. Okay, so sight adds tremendously to our experience of the world. But if we lose sight, we still have those other senses that are vital to enable you to move around in your environment. Can you imagine if a person is tactile defensive and they lose their sight? Okay, so the sense of touch is the first of our senses. The sense of sight is the last to develop. So if a person loses their sight and then they become tactile defensive, the entire sensory system, in a way, shuts down. It becomes exceptionally difficult for them to adjust. So it's important for us who are who are working with people with low vision or no vision to find out which is the preferred sensory modality. And there's a very simple way to do that. While the pen field alerted us to the reality that the eyes, they are random eye movements. I can choose to look at the person over there. I can look to, we can look all over, but that's random. You're choosing. But then there are more specific eye movements that's associated with different thought processes. So the moment you imagine something or you want to remember something you've seen, your eyes would automatically shoot up. The moment you recall anything you've heard, your eyes would immediately and unconsciously move towards the ears. And the moment one wants to remember what something felt like, something that you felt recently that was so intensely pleasurable, the moment we do that, your eyes would naturally look down. Now, I used to think that I look down every time I experience something on an emotional level, because feeling, eyes looking down, refers to both touch, but also being emotionally involved with something. You automatically move your eyes down. So when you turn your eyes down and you access the sense of touch, the sense of emotional or the emotional feeling or emotions, while the Penfield said those non-random movements give us clues as to which is a person's sensory preference. Well, then Bandler and Grinder then said, okay, let's plot this. And they did enormous modeling projects to figure out if this is really true and if there's patterns in people's eye movements. And they've wrote this up. It's really very interesting. And it is part of the neuro-linguistic programming training many years ago, but also the eye movement therapy. So they found eyes up, visual, eyes sideways, auditory, eyes down, indicate a more kinesthetic preference. And if you want to figure out which is your client's sensory preference, and if you want to figure out which is your own, you don't have to be sighted to do this test. You just put a blank piece of paper right in front of you, must be right in front of you, and then you draw a huge infinity sign lying on its side. So ideally you position the paper landscape, not portrait, not straight up, but to the side. And then you do one big infinity sign just one. You should, if you do it repeatedly, it's very difficult to read the shape. And the moment you draw a horizontal line through the crossing point of the 8, in other words, wherever it crosses, that's where you draw your horizontal line. Sometimes you may see that there is no crossing point. The middle of the two circles touch so strongly that there isn't a crossing point. There's a huge crossing area. You can't interpret that. But if a person draws a figure of 8, like it's on the screen at the moment, and it is much bigger above the crossing point, it indicates, it reflects, says Band and Grinder, that pattern, it's a myelinated pattern. That person tends to look up more than they look sideways or down. So, I'm sorry, that confirms that they have a preference for visual input. If they draw, in other words, the crossing point refers to the tip of your nose. So the crossing point represents the tip of your nose. So where do the eyes prefer to turn towards? Above nose level, to the side of the nose, or below. So if they turn the eyes more towards the ears, you tend to get one of two patterns. The one on the left, they're just much smaller as the previous ones because I put them next to each other. But if a person do the one on the left-hand side, you'll see it's flatter. It somehow looks a bit like a mask, a Zorro mask. Why? Because a person who is more auditory or prefers auditory input or input from their ears tend to turn their eyes towards the ears more often. And the one on the right just shows you the position on a page. And if you see, due to the size of the page, the figure of 8 was actually interrupted. If the page was a little bit bigger, it would have been rounded to the side. So if you see a figure of 8 that is flat on the side, close to the end of the paper, it also indicates that the person tends to turn their eyes towards the ears more often, and therefore they have an auditory preference. So if a person experiences visual trauma and they lose their sight, but their brain's preferred sensory modality is auditory, it is dreadful to lose their sight. But it is not half as dreadful as if the person has had a visual preference. So if you lose your sight when your sensory preferred modality is visual, it has a far greater impact than if it was auditory or kinesthetic. So remember the way we interpret this. We position a page right in front of the person, give them a pen or a pencil. We ask them to do one free-flowing infinity sign. We draw a horizontal line through the crossing point if there is a crossing point. And that crossing point represents their nose. And if you look at this figure of 8, you'll see your infinity sign. It's much smaller above the line than it is below the line. What does that mean? They look down towards what? Down towards their heart and their hand. You know, if you could just sit like a person who's depressed. You ever seen a person that's depressed? How do they sit? How do they tend to sit? How do they tend to walk? They tend to slouch and they tend to drop their head. Doesn't mean when a person has a kinesthetic, like the one on the screen, a kinesthetic preference that they're depressed. Not at all. There are loads of feelings that can be accessed when you look down. But I'm using depression at the moment as an example, just so you can recognize the kind of behavior that we sometimes see is when a person is depressed, they look down all the time. The work of Grinder and Bander said, when you look down to the one side, you access your emotions, and to the other side, you access something called internal dialogue, talking to yourself. So what happens when a person slouches? What happens when their head drops? We talk to ourselves and we feel, don't feel so good today. Oh no, I really don't feel so good today. And what happens? we become more and more, well, emotionally low. So when a person has an auditory or a kinesthetic preference and they lose their sight, it's terrible. But it is not as devastating as when they visual and they lose their sight. You see, ladies and gentlemen, what I love about the brain and what I love about this instrument that we've developed, it's not the truth. It's not the only truth. It's just a glimpse on what makes people tick. And it gives us a glimpse. I'm not going to talk about the hand and the foot because the hand and the foot has far less impact if compared to the impact of the senses in the brain. Okay, the hand and the foot is the cherry on the top. The sensory input has a profound effect because it's step one in the three-step process of input, processing, and output. Brain obviously has a huge impact as well. But because our focus is vision or the lack or the loss of vision, the beautiful thing about the brain is we can also always change. The beautiful thing about the brain is we can adapt. We just need to know what must be adapted. And looking at dominance really gives us a glimpse into somebody else's processing to understand, am I meeting resistance? Or has this person just lost their vocabulary? Not because there's injury to the language part of the brain, but maybe they've just gone to the right back part of the brain where there's very little language. It's the sensory part of the brain. It's the non-verbal side of the brain, and it's very difficult for them to express. Maybe you've got a client that comes to see you and they talk nonstop. You think, what is it with this person? You know, just breathe. So there's a gap so I can speak. Maybe when they traumatize, they move to the front left part of the brain, which is the absolute expressive part of the brain, verbal expressive part of the brain. That makes it very difficult for a person to just stop, go to the back part of the brain, and then we can have a conversation. You see, the advantage of this approach is not that we label. It doesn't enable you to label a person. It just gives you a glimpse into what makes them tick. And the moment you know a little bit more about what makes them tick, we give them the gift of understanding. I think one of the things that we all, as human beings, desperately want is to understand. It's a luxury to understand and to be understood. If you watch the movie Moulin Rouge, in that movie they say the greatest thing in the world is to love and be loved. I fully agree. I think there's something else that's equally important, and that's to understand yourself, your own behavior. Why do some people go through a similar experience and they seem to be okay with it? Why am I battling so much? What's wrong with me? The profile gives us some insight into what is your brain's default? What is your sensory preference? What's your natural default when things are difficult? And then it becomes so much easier to understand. And as they say in the musical time, from understanding comes caring, and from caring comes love. So the moment we understand, reasons are amazing, because the moment you have a reason for certain behavior, it becomes so much easier to understand yourself and another person, which makes it so much easier to care, which makes it so much easier to love. So this quote from Laura Boyd, I think, is absolutely brilliant. She says, "You and your plastic brain." Yeah, I really wonder who thought of the term neuroplasticity. Well, plasticity is still okay, but a plastic brain just doesn't sit well. Because if I think of plastic brain, I think of plastic container, and plastic container is not moldable. So you and your plastic brain, that's why it's in inverted commas, are constantly being shaped by the world around you, understand that everything you do, everything you encounter, and everything you experience is changing your brain. And that can be for the better, but it can also be for the worse. So when you leave today, go out and build the brain you want. So if you've realized that yourself or somebody else that you love, if you've realized that maybe I have misunderstood, maybe I misunderstood their behavior a little bit. Maybe they weren't resistant. Maybe they're not that difficult. Maybe they've lost their dominant sense and the not only the dominant, if they left eye dominant and they lost their left eye, maybe they lost their dominant sensory modality. But it can change. The beautiful thing of the brain, irrespective of age, the brain doesn't wear out. It is constantly willing to change, but we need to know what to change to make it easier for a person to adapt and then to live a full life in a very different way, maybe from before, but a full life nonetheless. Are there any questions? I would gladly answer if I can.
Yes, Melody, the first question is from an anonymous person who says, could you please recap which side of the brain is blue?
Left. Okay, so let's do it like this. It's just easier if we do red or right. So red and right, red, right, makes it a little bit easier. So that's the warmer part of the brain because it focuses on the nonverbals. Okay, so sometimes people say that's the EQ part of the brain. It's not really true because if you talk about EQ literacy, then you talk about the left brain. But the right brain is red and it's the warmer one. Okay, it's the more fuzzy one. Okay, blue is left. Unfortunately, blue and left don't, blue, the L in blue, and left goes hand in hand. Okay, so in our model, blue is left, and everything on the right-hand side, because the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. That means the right eye is blue, the right ear is blue, the right hand is blue, and the right foot is blue. Why? Because the right eye and ear plug into the left brain, and the left brain plug into the right hand and foot. So they work together. They share qualities or characteristics. And the same goes for the red right brain. And then the left eye, ear, hand, and foot would work like the red right hand brain, which is more creative, which is more nonverbal, which is more sensitive to mood and to atmosphere and things like that.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, that certainly makes it much easier to remember it that way. Thank you.
You're
and
welcome.
then Wendy says, please elaborate a little on neuro-linguistic programming.
Okay, let me just check time. No, we're over time. Okay, neuro-linguistic programming, that's actually a field of applied psychology that was very popular quite a few years ago. Neuro, nerve, linguistic, language, processing. So Band and Grinder did very interesting research, and they were some of the first people that popularized the idea that the brain is programmed in a way, and that we are all programmed in a way. But the programs can change, obviously. So neuro-linguistic programming, how you use the way they impacted on people was through language. But because they understood that the eye movements, and because they understood that people tend to process information in a specific way, they used language to shift state, to shift the way people thought or felt. Fascinating field if they want to go and do some research on it.
Yes, it certainly is a whole new area of expertise to look at. And then just a question from me. How fixed is our default reaction and the way that we process? Because I know that with myself, and certainly looking at my family, there are times when things happen that one withdraws completely, and there are times that one never stops talking. So that seems terribly contradictory to me. And when it happens in the same people, how do we explain that?
Karen, is it you talking?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. Okay, Karen, it's a marvelous question, and it actually relates to a level of maturity. So you see, maturity means we use all our bits. Yes, we do have a default, but life has taught us to move beyond our default. Okay, so in a mature person, think of the different bits of your profile as gears. And there are times when it's very good to go left, to be very critical and analytical and stand your ground on fact. There's time, especially if the relationship is very important, that we don't want to stand on fact. We want to move more to the right and say, I may not agree, and we may agree to disagree, but the relationship is too important to argue this point. So maturity means you shift according to situation. When you mature, sorry?
No, I just said, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, so when we in a natural default, okay, what happens? You either go back or front, but if you mature, you go back and be quiet when it's appropriate, and you talk when it's appropriate. That's the level of maturity. Emotions, whether you stay in your emotions or whether you rise above the emotions, because you have to, Einstein said it so beautifully. He said, if you have a hiccup on an emotional level, you can't solve it there. You have to go one level higher, which is you need to go to the rational part of the brain to solve an emotional issue. So if you have a rational hiccup, you have to go to a spiritual level to resolve that, because otherwise we get stuck. You can't solve a problem on the same level as where it occurred. So I hope that answered your question. We all have a default, but the purpose of maturity is actually to go beyond your default. But if the pawpaw hits the fan, we still tend to default to our deepest default because it's the most myelinated pathways.
Oh, okay. Yes, thank you. That certainly makes a lot of sense. And then Elna says, any comments on cross dominance? For example, right eye and left hand dominance.
Okay, so for years and years in education, we said the ideal dominance is uniform. Uniform means the brain on the one side is dominant and everything else on the other side. Well, there's truth in that, in the sense that if this side of my brain controls this side of my body, it means information would flow much quicker. If information comes in through my right eye, it goes to the controlling left brain and immediately out to my right hand. That makes for a much faster pathway. And the same would happen to the other side. If it's a left eye, right brain, left hand, it would be a much faster pathway than if I have a right ear, a right eye, a right brain, and a left hand. Because when you have a right eye, the information needs to go to the left side of the brain because it's the controlling side in our model. Then it needs to go to the right brain for interpretation before it can go out the left hand. So it's a slower pathway. In our experience, years and years of experience in this field, cross dominance is not a problem as long as the pathways are extremely well myelinated.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And then Bronwyn says, Dr. De Jager is very passionate, thank you. And
thank you, so she is.
Definitely, thank goodness for all of us.
I just wanted to say something. I think that neuroplasticity comes from the word plasticine, which is the clay that we play with. And that is the malleability they talk about.
Fantastic. I just didn't like her terminology of you and your plastic brain. I thought, I see Tupperware.
Maybe it should be plasticine brain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there no further questions?
That's the end of the questions. Thank you, B.
Melodie, thank you so much. And I'm sure that we will definitely have another session at a later stage this year. And I think that it's really important to understand and be able to try and guide your patient about understanding all these differences and how to, once they understand where it's coming from, that it's a lot easier for them to adapt.
Belinda, you know what is also important? Us as, well, call us a therapist, or call us a guide, or call us a coach, or whatever you want to, professional. We need to understand our way of doing as well. Quite a few years ago, just as in closing, I worked with a psychologist, and it was a fascinating experience where she would send her clients, I would profile, and then I would send the clients back for her to do her job. And this relationship started because she told me about a client that she really was really resisting therapy. And whatever she suggested she does, she never did it. And it started off because it's a friend of mine, not the client, the therapist. And I said to her, why don't you send the person to me? Let me profile and let's see what's happening. And then when I fed back to her and I said, well, one thing I can tell you, it's very difficult for this person to read. And she said, what an idiot I've been, because she keeps on sending her articles to read and she doesn't read it. And she thinks, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? I'm passing you this amazing information. But she had, and I don't like limiting people or labeling them and therefore limiting them to what they really can do. But she had a red eye preference and a red brain preference. Okay, and that's not necessarily the easiest combination for reading. I mean, red eye, red brain is a guest reader. And I can say that categorically because I do have a red eye and a red brain. And I read fast and I read a lot. But my word, I can read a whole novel. And if you ask me who were the main characters, I have no clue. But I understood the story 100%. And it was in that understanding that the therapist's approach and the client's need, there was a mismatch. And it is sometimes when we understand our own way and our own preference. And I mean, if it makes sense to me to read a lot, I would imagine that it would make sense to everybody else as well. And just in a last example, my oldest son was a tremendous role model to me on many different levels. And one of the things was that whenever we were in a church environment, he would be looking down all over the show, and I would pump him in the ribs like only an Afrikaans person in the church mother can do with her son. And he would give me the dirtiest of looks. And then when we left, I would say, okay, so why didn't you pay attention? He said, but I did. And I said, no, but you weren't looking at the minister. And I said, but I don't need to. And I thought, Melody, you're such an idiot, and we all do this. I'm just sharing responsibility with everybody quickly. But we often forget what we learn when it comes to our own family and ourselves, because he's highly auditory. And when a person is auditory, that means they don't have to look at you to pay attention. They actually listen better when they don't look at you. And so we can go on for hours.
Very interesting. Hold on, there's somebody else.
There's two more comments. The one says, thank you, I learned a lot of understanding, especially the blue and red. And then people are asking for the easiest way to contact you, Melodie, please.
That last slide in the PowerPoint, I'm sure we can share that information. I can pull it up, but Belinda, would you mind sharing the email address?
I will do
Okay,
so.
there's a website as well, but I'll just confirm with you when we're done, if you want to share that with everybody.
Excellent, excellent. And for those people that were worried about load shedding, presentation will be available next week. Thank you so much. And just before we leave, just remember, there's no webinar next week because it's a public holiday, and we will send out the notifications for the next ones in the following week. Melodie, thank you so much. It's always a fabulous lecture from you. Thank you so much.